Jack the Ripper, probably the most prolific serial killer we've ever known. Also, one of the first serial killers ever known. We still don't know the mystery to who that person was. Was it a woman? Was it a man? Who was Jack the Ripper? What if I told you he may not have been from England at all? Maybe he started his crime spree all the way across the sea in the South, in Austin, Texas, years before he traveled to Britain. It's a wild out there conspiracy theory, right? But there also suspiciously is a case in Austin that resembles a lot of Jack the Ripper before he even began in England. There's no way it could be true, right? Would it even be possible? Well, here's the story. Hey, I'm Serenity and welcome to my channel. Welcome to day 2 of Holiday Hometown Horror Week, where every day between that week between Christmas and New Year, from the 26th to 30th, I'm going to be posting one true crime video to get us through this weird week where time kind of stops still. So today's episode, we're going to be talking about the servant girl Annihilator in Austin, Texas. One of the most odd unsolved mysteries Texas has ever seen. It gets pretty interesting. So before we begin, I want to give trigger warnings for the following: slashers, serial killer, discrimination, child abuse, and a couple more things. Anything in that realm. Think of, if you know the Jack the Ripper case, all those apply here. If you can't stomach any of the above, please stop watching. Put yourselves first, and I'll see you at a later date with a different video. If I get any information wrong, please kindly let me know down below. I actually did locate the case files, which was interesting to read through. I try to get my information as accurate as possible, but sometimes errors do happen. If one source claims one thing and I can't verify it using other sources, I leave that detail out completely or go with the most commonly reported. Sources will all be linked down below for you to check out yourself. Lastly, this video is an informational research study that I'm sharing for academic entertainment reasons only. I mean absolutely no harm to anyone mentioned, especially the victim and the victim's family. Get comfy, get into your winter pajama, grab a cozy blanket. This one is from YouTube. Grab a snack, grab a warm drink. This is actually a mug that looks like Nova, but also just Dr. Pepper. And now let's begin. Austin, Texas is actually the capital of Texas, the state, with the motto of Keep Austin Weird being known as the home of Lake Travis, where you can go inner tubing, and Longhorn football, one of Texas's favorite Saturday pastime, watching college football. It also is home to 6th Street, known for partying, outdoor activities, and one of the best putt-putt courses I've ever been to. But hiding below all that barbecue and cowboy boots and Austin City Limits Music Festival, everything that keeps Austin weird is a cold case that has lingered over the city for centuries. The Midnight Assassin, better known as the servant girl Annihilator, an unidentified American serial killer who we actually never really hear about, but they terrorized the city of Austin between the years of 1884 to 1885. The name for the serial killer actually originated by a writer named O. Henry, who penned an 8-part series about 8 separate axe murders happening in the city, nicknaming the killer the Servant Girl Murderers. So O. Henry was actually a pen name for a short story writer named William Sidney Porter, an Austin writer who accidentally coined the term Servant Girl Annihilator on May 10th, 1885. He actually penned this name accidentally because he was writing a letter to a close friend named Dave Hall, which stated, and I quote, "Town is fearfully dull except for the frequent raids of the servant girl annihilators, who make things lively in the dull hours of the night." So while today we refer to this case as the servant girl annihilators, no newspaper or published source at that time ever referenced this serial killer as such. So what actually happened? On December 26, 1885, the New York Times, the big newspaper, published a report that the murders were committed by some cunning madman who is insane on their subject of killing women, and I quote. It was the first time a large, nationwide public newspaper discussed a case happening down in the South. The Midnight Assassin was known as being one of the first serial killers operating in the United States. In fact, it was 3 years before the Jack the Ripper ever killed his first victim, and that case took over Whitechapel in England. So before we get deeper into the details of the serial killer, who they were, let's draw some parallels between Jack the Ripper and Servant Annihilator Killer. Author of the book The Complete History of Jack the Ripper, Philip Sungen, wrote that to them, it seemed like the Midnight Assassin and Jack the Ripper were actually the same man, according to their own research, starting their crimes in October of 1888, when Jack the Ripper and the Midnight Assassin, who they believed was the same person, started their first ever killing spree. This theory was based on the Atlanta Constitution's editor's suggestion to the serial killer might actually also being Jack the Ripper based on how the murders by the Ripper and the servant girl Annihilator were too similar. So the Ripper's victim, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Edelrose, were similar to the murders by the servant girl Annihilators. Those two victims paralleled every other killing by the servant girl Annihilator. A local newspaper magazine called Texas Monthly released a piece on this case, stating the serial killer murdered 7 women, 2 of which were white women, 5 were black women, and 1 black man in the span of 2 years. Additionally, the killer had injured 6 other women besides the death count and 2 more men. The killer's MO was to attack the victims indoors at night, where the killer would actually end their life while they were asleep in their own beds, possibly the safest place they could be. 5 of the women were attacked, then dragged unconscious outdoors, where the killer would then end their life. 3 of those 5 women were severely mutilated outside while outdoors. Now, all the victims were found in a similar manner, with the women having a sharp object inserted into their ears. However, like I did state, since the majority of their victims were black women, their murders were actually completely overlooked by authorities, and it wouldn't be until 2 white women were killed that the serial killer's crimes would become well-known news and then be reported on, and that reign of terror would end. Elua Phillips was actually only 17 years old when she was murdered on the night of December 24th, 1885. And that very night, Susan Hancock was attacked while sleeping in the bed of her 16-year-old child, her daughter. So they were sharing a bed that night. However, Susan's murder was quickly pinned on her own husband, Moses, but he was actually acquitted very soon after. Elua Phillips' husband, James Phillips, was also arrested as the prime suspect in the murder of his own wife. James was convicted after multiple witnesses testified that he repeatedly said he would end Elua's life if he ever found out she was cheating on him. Claims that were not true, but that's something he would say to people. Now, this was backed up by his previously documented violent outbursts. He was a very violent man. So James Phillip was found guilty of murdering his wife. However, later down the line, his conviction would be overturned when they realized she was actually one of the victims of this serial killer that no one knew about. So let's discuss the 6 other victims. Now, there's not much information on them as I would like to give you, but here's what we do know. 25-year-old Molly Smith was killed on the night of December 30th, 1884. And that same night, Walter Spencer was also severely wounded. 3 months later, the averaging cooling off period of a serial killer. On March 19th, 1885, 2 Swedish servant girls, Clara Strand and Christine Martinson, were severely injured. 2 months later after that, on May 6, 1885, Elizabeth Shelley was killed. A few weeks later of that same month, on May 22nd, 1885, Irene Cross was murdered by a man with a knife in the middle of the night. A few months after that, another long period of cooling off. In August of 1855, Clara Dick was severely wounded. That same month, on August 20th, 1885, 11-year-old Mary Ramsey was murdered with her mom, Rebecca Ramsey, being severely injured. Almost a month later, on September 28th, 1885, Gracie Vance and her boyfriend, Orange Washington, were both killed. So there's not a ton of information on these cases, individual people, who they were, what they like to do, their personal lives, if they were married, if they had a family, anything like that. They sadly are all kind of lumped together just as victims. We don't know much about them. But as you can see, 8 people were murdered within a 2-year period, with the cooling off period between kills being shorter and shorter. This was one person who was a killer and very dangerous, but it wasn't until the deaths of Elua Phillips and Susan Hancock, 2 white women, when all the other victims were people of color, did the killer stop, because it was getting attention in the city. So the question is, after the killing stopped, what happened? Well, many people believe he fled to England, furthest way you can get, and became Jack the Ripper because he was worried that investigators might find him. That's just the theory. So speaking of the Ripper, several American cowboys from the South were interviewed by London authorities specifically in belief of them being the Whitechapel killer, being Jack the Ripper. They were interviewing American cowboys. One of those American cowboys was a man named Buck Taylor, a performer in the Buffalo Bills Wild West show, who was actually born in Fredericksburg, Texas, about 70 miles west of Austin, Texas. They're like out cities, pretty much. And he was actually traveling in the London area at the time when Jack the Ripper started his attacks. So that front page New York Times article we spoke about earlier that was published on December 26, 1885, was just 2 days after that last killing happened that was documented. That's when it was published. Because of that article being published on a national scale, 400 different men were arrested in hopes of that year of being interviewed and them being the one to be the midnight assassin. According to Texas Monthly, multiple elected officials actually refused to believe it was just one man or a group of men responsible for the murders. They actually didn't have any real theories. Instead, they actually believed it was a set of copycat killers, and that's why it stopped so suddenly. Because the MO was people of color, once 2 white women were killed, that's when it stopped, because everyone realized they could no longer get away with that by being copycat killers because they messed up the MO. Even though all the murders were exactly the same, with some sort of sharp object in their ears, dragged outside, their lives ended outside, always women, who usually were servant workers. Now, this is very similar to the Boston Strangler case, which I have covered, where it's believed that once the crimes were actually being reported on, men used the strangler's motive to harm their own victims of their choosing. The African American community and local practitioners of voodoo had the belief that the white man who had magical capabilities enabled him to become invisible during this time period, because none of the dogs in any of these women's lives actually barked when the intruder came into their yard. So if the dog was out in the yard or in the house, they never barked in the fence yard or in the house. So the women, the victims, were never alerted by their dog being upset by a loud noise or the gate opening or a dog barking, anything like that. It was just silent. But there was another reason besides the last 2 victims seemingly being white women to be the reason why the killer stopped. And it was actually because additional officers were hired. You see, once this case started becoming mainstream and once they started to see there was actually a pattern, police began offering rewards, and citizens came together to form a nighttime patrol committee to keep an eye on the street during the evening. Now, local newspapers actually had reported what they did know on the crime, which is that the murderer or murderers would flee the scene on foot. But that was never a fully credited tip to the case, so people who were on night watch, they never saw anyone who ran away from a crime scene because it doesn't know that tip isn't credible. About 115 years later, the Texas Monthly received an article in July of 2000 stating that there was actually an eyewitness that we never knew about. And this eyewitness account was by someone claiming to have seen the murderer with their own 2 eyes. However, this information became contradictory with police reports of that night. Now, this killer, because we don't know who they are, multiple different eyewitness reports and people who said they might have saw something that night had contradicting statements. Some said he had light complexion, some said he had darker complexion, or had Asian features, wearing a lamp black paint, blackface paint. Basically, blackface is what we'd call it nowadays, to conceal his skin color, so it wouldn't be him who would be pointed at, because that is not his natural skin tone. Other reports stated that it was a man wearing a mother-style hubbard dress, which is kind of like a tunic. So it would look like a woman from the outside during those times. Now, there was also reports that this was actually a duo or a gang of killers. So honestly, there was no concrete answer. It could be someone who was doing blackface. It could be someone local to the neighborhood. It could be someone wearing a woman's dress. It could be someone in a duo, a group of killers. It could be a gang of them. There was no credible, this is who it was situation. 14 years later, after that Texas Monthly report, on July 15th, 2014, the PBS network aired an episode of History Detectives on the Servant Girl Annihilator killings. They used modern forensic techniques along with historical research on the case to create a profile on who the serial killer could most likely be and see if they could narrow down who did it using any evidence and clues. They mapped the geological profiles, psychological profiling too of what this person would have tendencies to do, and they came to one suspect, a 19-year-old African-American cook named Nathaniel Elgin. Now, this was interesting because Nathaniel at the time worked in close proximity to the crime scenes of the 6 women who all worked as servants. Another interesting fact was that a footprint that they did locate that they believed to be from the killer had no pinky toe indentation in the shoe. So that would indicate that the killer either doesn't walk on that toe or they don't have that toe. Well, Nathaniel was actually missing his pinky toe on that foot. Now, we all know that the murders ended in December of 1885. Well, in February of 1886, Nathaniel Elgin was actually shot and killed by police officers while he was fleeing the scene after being caught attempting to assault a young girl. He does seem like the most likely suspect in this case based on the information we do have and can confirm. To this day, the case still remains unsolved and has gone cold. What we do know for a fact is the details of each crime scene. Every single one had a bloody axe or another sharp object left behind as the murder weapon. Footprints were found at the scene of some crime scenes, where bloodhounds would be brought in to hopefully sniff out the killer's scent. One of the last victims, Susan Hancock, was found with her head cleaved into 2 separate pieces. Most of the victims were female, with only one male victim, because it was his girlfriend who was the intended victim. It was also after the last 2 victims' deaths did the police really begin to get involved. The public demanded action regardless of possible mob violence occurring, which was the first initial theory. family. But something interesting about the case. The victims were servant girls coined by the public. That is who the name we use is. During this time period, African American women often worked as domestic servants in Austin. But one of the victims was a male boyfriend of the intended targets. So the moniker being the servant girl Annihilator erases one of the victims and just reduces them to 6 servant girls. One victim was also a child. One was the daughter of a servant who was attacked but thankfully lived. So Nathaniel being plausible as the most likely suspect because of his position. He worked in the servant sector and people talk. He had direct access to these situations. But the case truly does still remain unsolved, and we can only hope that one day we truly do get the justice this case deserves, so the families of the victims can find peace and the answers they deserve. And that is all the information I have on the servant girl Annihilator case. It's very interesting because it parallels so much to Jack the Ripper. I truly do believe this is a case we can figure out and get solved, especially if one day we find out for concrete evidence that who Jack the Ripper was, maybe we could link it back here. But that is all I have. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. All my socials are linked down below. Follow me if you want. Make sure you are subscribing because we have 3 more Holiday Hometown Horror Week videos left before the new year. And as always, love you, minute kisses, don't do anything stupid, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye!